I'm just, I've been staying out of the way of law enforcement all this time. I thought I was doing the best thing by not coming down on law enforcement. And it's been too many years of no action. Nothing's been done. So I'm tired of waiting. The investigator over the case right now out of Scurry County, he told me one time, he said he doesn't care if it takes 20 years to do this. And I do care if it takes 20 years. I don't want the person that hurt my kid that doesn't need to walk the street for 20 years.
Most parents believe the worst day of their life is something that could never actually happen to them. But for Clint Dunn, that nightmare became reality. For years, he stayed quiet, trusting the investigation and believing that eventually the truth would come out. He avoided criticizing the police and tried to stay patient while they worked on the case. But as time passed, that patience slowly turned into frustration. Nothing seemed to move forward. Years went by without answers, without justice, and without the person responsible being held accountable. Clint later admitted that he couldn't accept the idea that someone who hurt his daughter could continue living freely for decades while the family waited for the truth. For him, waiting 20 years for justice simply wasn't an option. This story begins on December 27, 2010, in a quiet place called Colorado City, Texas. It's a small town where most people know each other and life usually moves at a slow, peaceful pace. But on that winter morning, something happened that would eventually shock the entire community and turn a simple neighborhood into the center of a long and painful mystery. 13-year-old Hailey Dunn woke up that morning inside her mother's house. It was still early, around 5:30 a.m., when her mother's boyfriend, Sean Shaw Atkins, left the house. He was heading to work in a nearby town called Snyder. About half an hour later, he arrived at his workplace, bought a drink, and turned, in his work uniform. Just 10 minutes after arriving, he drove away. According to him, he had an argument with his boss and quit his job on the spot. At the time, that explanation didn't seem too important. But later, investigators would discover that the truth behind that story was very different. Back at the house in Colorado City, Hailey was alone. Her mother, Billie Jean Dunn, was preparing to leave for work before heading out for her long 12-hour shift. She briefly checked on her daughter. Hailey was still asleep in her bed. Everything looked completely normal. There were no signs that anything unusual was about to happen that day. Hours passed quietly. The house remained silent. Then, around 2 in the afternoon, a short text message was sent from the phone that Billie had left at home for the kids to use. The message went to one of Hailey's friends. It simply said, "What are you doing?" The friend never responded. And at the time, it didn't seem like anything important. But later, that small message would become one of the last known signs that Hailey might have still been in the house. Across the street, Hailey's father, Clint Dunn, was going about his day. Even though he and Billie were divorced, Clint lived very close to his children. In fact, Hailey visited him almost every day. Sometimes she would stop by before school just to say hello. Other times she would visit after school or stay for dinner. It had become part of their daily routine. But on December 27th, something strange happened. Hailey never came by. At first, Clint didn't think too much about it. Maybe she was busy or spending time with friends. But as the hours passed, the silence started to feel unusual. Around 3 in the afternoon, Sean Atkins returned to Colorado City. According to his version of events, he arrived home and saw Hailey at around 3:15 p.m. He said she was leaving the house and heading across the street to visit her father. But later, when investigators analyzed cell tower data from his phone, they discovered something that didn't match his story at all. At the exact time he claimed to be home, his phone signal showed he was almost 40 miles away from Colorado City. In other words, it would have been nearly impossible for him to be where he said he was. Meanwhile, Hailey's older brother, David, arrived home around 4 in the afternoon. When he got there, he noticed the front door was locked. He knocked repeatedly, but no one answered. After waiting for a while, he climbed into the house through a window. Inside the hallway, he saw Sean standing there. Later, David would describe the moment in a strange way. He said Sean looked startled and confused, almost like someone who had just been caught off guard. The image stuck with him for years. That evening, Sean drove to pick Billy up from her job. When they returned home together, something immediately felt wrong. Hailey wasn't there. Billy asked Sean if he had seen her daughter. He told her that Hailey had walked over to her father's house earlier and that she planned to stay overnight at a friend's place. At first, that explanation seemed reasonable. Hailey had spent nights at friends' houses before. But when Billy contacted Clint, he said Hailey had never come to his house that day. And when they checked with the friend Sean mentioned, she said Hailey never showed up there either. Suddenly, the situation didn't make sense anymore. The next morning, Billy looked around Hailey's bedroom carefully. Everything was still exactly where it should be. Her clothes were there. Her belongings were untouched. Nothing suggested she had packed anything or planned to stay overnight anywhere. For a 13-year-old girl who loved her family, her school, and her friends, disappearing without taking anything at all was extremely unusual. Eventually, on December 28th, a missing person report was finally filed. At first, police considered the possibility that Hailey might simply be a runaway. But that idea quickly started to fall apart. Hailey was known as an energetic and happy teenager. She was a cheerleader, played the saxophone in school, and participated in several sports, including volleyball, basketball, and softball. She loved spending time with her friends and had a strong relationship with her father. Running away didn't seem to fit her personality. Soon the entire town began helping with the search. Volunteers walked through neighborhoods, checked empty areas, and distributed flyers with Hailey's photo. Clint Dunn personally searched everywhere he could think of. He looked through trash dumpsters, walked down alleys, and scanned every street hoping to see some sign of his daughter. But while the search continued, many people began noticing something strange. Sean Atkins, the man who lived in the house, with Hailey, wasn't helping. He wasn't handing out flyers, he wasn't joining the volunteers, and he rarely spoke to investigators. For a small town where everyone expected neighbors to come together in a crisis, his behavior quickly caught people's attention. And just 4 days after Hailey disappeared, something happened that made the situation feel even more disturbing. A New Year's Eve party was held at the house where Billy and Sean lived. Music, people, and celebration filled the home. At the same time, just across the street, Hailey's father, Clint, stood on his porch, with binoculars in his hands, scanning the neighborhood again and again, hoping to catch even the smallest glimpse of his daughter. While one house was filled with celebration, another was filled with fear and heartbreak. As investigators slowly began reviewing phone records, bank transactions, and travel history, the story Sean Atkins had told started to collapse piece by piece, and the deeper authorities looked into that December day, the clearer it became that something about his version of events simply didn't add up. To truly understand how this case unfolded and why suspicion eventually centered on one man, we need to go back even further and take a closer look at Hailey's life, her family, and the events that quietly led up to the day she disappeared. Because sometimes the biggest clues in a mystery are hidden in the details that people overlook at the beginning. To understand what may have happened to Hailey Dunn, it's important to look at the environment she grew up in and the people around her during the final months of her life. From the outside, Colorado City looked like the kind of place where nothing terrible ever happens. With a population of fewer than 4,000 people, it was the type of town where neighbors knew each other. Families had lived there for generations. and children could still ride their bikes around the neighborhood without much worry. Hailey Dunn was exactly the kind of teenager people in that town loved. She was energetic, playful, and full of personality. Her father, Clint, often described her as a bit of a tomboy. She loved sports and competition, but at the same time she enjoyed the simple things many teenage girls liked: music, friends, and anything shiny or fun. Her mother, Billie Jean Dunn, remembered her as a cheerful child who always had a big smile and a contagious laugh. Friends from school said Hailey wasn't shy about speaking her mind. She joked around constantly and loved making people laugh. By the time she reached 8th grade, Hailey was involved in almost everything at school. She was a cheerleader and played the saxophone in band. On top of that, she was part of multiple sports teams, including volleyball, basketball, and softball. Teachers described her as a friendly and social student who got along with almost everyone. But Hailey's family life had already gone through major changes. When she was 10 years old, her parents divorced. After the separation, Hailey and her older brother David moved in with their mother. At the time, Billy was already in a relationship with a man named Sean Shaw Atkins, and he eventually moved into the house with them. Even though the family structure had changed, Hailey still stayed extremely close to her father, Clint. Dunn lived directly across the street from Billy's house. Because of that, Hailey saw him almost every single day. Sometimes she would run over before school just to say hello. Other days, she would stop by after classes or stay for dinner. It had become such a routine that Clint could almost predict when she would show up at his door. Christmas of 2010 had been a happy time for Hailey. According to her grandmother Connie, Hailey had been in an especially good mood that year. She was excited about the gifts she received, particularly a brand new iPod that she had wanted for a long time. She spent most of Christmas Day and the day after Christmas at her father's house enjoying the holiday. That weekend seemed completely normal. On the night of December 26th, Hailey stayed home while her older brother David went to a friend's house to spend the night. Hailey stayed up late playing video games before eventually going to sleep. Then came the morning of December 27th. At around 5:30 a.m., Shaw Atkins left the house to go to work. About an hour later, Billy also left for her 12-hour shift. Before leaving, she checked Hailey's bedroom and saw her still asleep. According to Billy, the plan for the day was simple. Hailey would stay home alone until either her brother or parents returned. Billy assumed that once Hailey woke up, she would probably walk across the street to visit her father, just like she usually did. But that never happened. As investigators later reconstructed the timeline, the events of that morning became extremely important. Shaw arrived at work in Snyder shortly after 6 a.m. Witnesses confirmed that he entered the workplace, bought a drink, turned in his uniform, and then left, only 10 minutes later. According to him, he had gotten into an argument with his boss and decided to quit the job immediately. After leaving Snyder, Shaw claimed he drove to his mother's house in Big Spring. He said he went there to use her computer and apply for unemployment benefits online. Later in the afternoon, he said he drove back to Colorado City and arrived home shortly before 3 o'clock. That was his story. But as the investigation continued, phone data would begin to raise serious questions about that timeline. Meanwhile, Hailey's father, Clint, spent most of that day expecting his daughter to stop by like she always did. But hours passed without any sign of her. No knock on the door. No text message. No quick visit. Then at around 2 in the afternoon, the text message was sent from the phone left in the house. "What are you doing?" That message would later become one of the last possible signs that Hailey was still alive inside the house that day. When evening arrived and Hailey still hadn't appeared anywhere, Billy started asking questions. Sean told her the same story he would later repeat to investigators. According to him, Hailey had left the house sometime between 3 and 3:30 p.m. She supposedly told him she was going to visit her father and then spend the night at a friend's house named Mary Beth. At the time, Billy believed him. But the next morning changed everything. When Hailey didn't return home, Billy decided to call Mary Beth's parents. They immediately confirmed that Hailey had never come to their house and had not spent the night there. Now the situation became much more serious. Billy began going door to door in the neighborhood asking if anyone had seen her daughter. Nobody had. Later, Billy said she feared something terrible might have happened. She wondered if someone could have driven by and abducted Hailey while she was walking somewhere in town. Another possibility that crossed her mind was that Hailey might have been upset about something and left the house angrily without telling anyone. But investigators quickly noticed something strange. Nothing from Hailey's room was missing. Her clothes were still there. Her belongings were untouched. Even basic items someone would take for a sleepover were still exactly where they had been before. Eventually, the missing person report was filed during the afternoon of December 28th. At first, authorities classified the case as a possible runaway situation, but many people in the community strongly disagreed with that assumption. Hailey simply didn't fit the profile of a runaway teenager. She loved school, loved sports, and was deeply connected to her family. As the search expanded, volunteers from all across the town came together to help find her. Streets were searched, nearby areas were checked, and flyers with Hailey's picture began appearing everywhere. Clint Dunn was especially active in the search. Day after day, he walked through the town looking for any clue. He checked dumpsters, empty buildings, and alleys. Friends and neighbors later said they could see the desperation in his face as he searched for his daughter. But while the town was working together to find Hailey, many people noticed that Shaw Atkins remained distant. He didn't participate in search groups. He didn't distribute flyers, and he avoided conversations with investigators whenever possible. That behavior raised quiet suspicions among many people in the community. Then, only 4 days after Hailey disappeared, something happened that shocked many residents. Billy and Shaw held a New Year's Eve gathering at their home. While friends and relatives visited the house that night, Clint Dunn stood outside his own home across the street, scanning the darkness, with binoculars and hoping to see some sign that his daughter might still be alive somewhere nearby. The contrast between those two scenes deeply disturbed many people who heard about it later. As days turned into weeks, investigators started digging deeper into every detail of the case. They examined phone records, travel routes, financial activity, and witness statements. And with each new piece of information, Shawn Atkins's story began to fall apart. What started as a simple missing child case was slowly turning into something much darker. And as detectives continued uncovering new information about the household Hailey had been living in, they began realizing that the truth about her disappearance might be hidden much closer to home than anyone first imagined. As the investigation into Hailey Dunn's disappearance continued, detectives began shifting their attention toward the people closest to her. In many missing child cases, investigators first look at the immediate family and those who had regular contact with the child. And in Hailey's case, that meant focusing heavily on the home she shared with her mother and Shaw Atkins. At first glance, the house on Chestnut Street looked like an ordinary family home. But as reporters and investigators started digging deeper, a more complicated picture of life inside that house began to emerge. Several people who knew Hailey later shared troubling details about the relationship between her and Shaw Atkins. According to some of her friends and relatives, Hailey didn't feel comfortable around him at all. In fact, a few people close to her said she was actually afraid of him. One of Hailey's relatives later explained that the girl had told them she didn't trust Shaw. She reportedly felt uneasy whenever he was around. On some occasions, Hailey even said she didn't want to stay in the house when he was there. Her grandmother Connie also shared something unsettling. Hailey had once told her that late at night, she sometimes saw Shaw's shadow outside her bedroom door. According to Hailey, the shadow would appear quietly in the hallway while she was trying to sleep. She said it scared her and made her worry that he might come into her room while she was asleep. Those statements would later make investigators take a much closer look at the dynamics inside the home. Another piece of information that caught attention. was the relationship between Billy and Shaw. Police records revealed that the couple had already been on law enforcement's radar months before Hailey disappeared. About 10 months earlier, officers had been called to their home because of a domestic dispute. Both Billy and Shaw had contacted the police separately to complain about each other. When officers arrived at the house that day, the situation was chaotic. The couple was arguing loudly, and emotions were running high. Billy reportedly told officers that Shaw had threatened her life and said he would kill her in a way that would be remembered for a long time. Shaw, on the other hand, claimed Billy had taken a large number of pills and was threatening to harm herself. Despite the tension and the accusations, the argument eventually cooled down. Like many previous disputes between them, the situation passed and the two reconciled. Shaw continued living in the house with Billy and the children. For investigators looking at Hailey's disappearance, those past incidents raised serious concerns. As the case progressed, detectives asked both Billy and Shaw to take polygraph tests, but even that process became complicated. During the first attempt, the tests couldn't be completed because both of them were under the influence of drugs. Billy later explained that she had taken prescribed anxiety medication from her doctor. Shaw, however, repeatedly walked out of the testing process. At one point, he left the room during the exam, claiming investigators were treating him unfairly and trying to pressure him into confessing to something he didn't do. He described the entire process as a witch hunt. Even so, during one of the polygraph sessions, Shaw gave investigators two answers that would later stand out. When asked where he believed Hailey might be, he gave a short response: Scurry County. That answer immediately caught attention, because at the time there was no public reason to connect Hailey's disappearance to that area. Then investigators asked another question: who should police be looking at as possible suspects? Shaw's response was even more surprising: both of us. The polygraph analysis suggested that those two answers were truthful. But when detectives asked him to explain what he meant, Shaw refused to elaborate and ended the interview. Meanwhile, investigators were continuing to examine other pieces of evidence. Phone records and cell tower data became especially important in reconstructing the timeline of December 27th. And that's where major inconsistencies began appearing in Shaw's story. Earlier, he had claimed that after quitting his job in Snyder, he drove straight to his mother's house in Big Spring to apply for unemployment benefits. But phone records showed something different. Between 6:35 a.m. and 6:56 a.m., his phone connected to a cell tower in Colorado City, the very town he had supposedly already left behind. Colorado City was nearly 50 miles away from Big Spring, meaning his phone shouldn't have been anywhere near there if his story had been true. Later signals did show his phone in Big Spring, but only between around 9:38 a.m. and 2:40 p.m. That timeline created a huge problem for Shaw's version of events. Remember, he had claimed to be back in Colorado City around 3 hours p.m., where he supposedly saw Hailey leaving the house around 3:15. But phone data showed his device was still in Big Spring at 2:40 p.m. Traveling 40 miles in just 20 minutes would have been practically impossible. Another important detail came from Hailey's brother David. He told investigators that when he returned home around 4 p.m. that day, the front door was locked. After knocking for a long time with no response, he climbed inside through a window. When he entered the hallway, he saw Shaw standing there. David later said Shaw looked extremely confused, almost like someone who had just been caught doing something unexpected. That image stayed with him for years. More disturbing details began surfacing as investigators looked deeper into Shaw's behavior after Hailey disappeared. One conversation described by Hailey's uncle stood out in particular. According to him, he once told Shaw that he couldn't understand how anyone could hurt a child. Shaw responded with a chilling comparison. He said it was like killing a deer. That statement shocked the family and raised even more suspicion. At the same time, Financial records showed another strange detail about the night Hailey disappeared. After Shaw picked Billy up from work around 6 p.m., the two of them stopped at two separate ATMs and withdrew about $140 in cash. At first, Billy told investigators the money was used for groceries and gas, but later it was discovered that the cash had actually been spent on drugs. Because of those concerns, investigators decided to take a closer look inside the house itself. During the search, detectives discovered something unexpected. Billy and Shaw had printed hundreds of pages from the internet. Many of those articles were about serial killers, violent crimes, sexual sadism, and murders involving family members. When asked about it, Billy said the interest was simply curiosity. She claimed that many people were fascinated by true crime stories and that it didn't mean anything more than that. But investigators continued documenting every detail. Then, on January 12, 2011, authorities officially named Shaw Atkins as a person of interest in Hailey's disappearance. Despite the growing suspicion around him, Shaw continued denying any involvement. But only weeks later, investigators uncovered something far more disturbing while examining digital devices connected to the household. Authorities discovered over 100,000 images of child pornography stored on a USB drive and on a computer located at Shaw's mother's house. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. However, because multiple people had access to the devices, authorities had to determine exactly who was responsible for the files. The evidence was sent to a grand jury for further review. Even with all of these alarming discoveries, no immediate arrests were made. But behind the scenes, the case was becoming far more complicated than anyone had imagined at the beginning. And as months turned into years without answers, the search for Hailey slowly began turning into something else, a long and painful fight for justice. Because the truth about what happened to Hailey Dunn was still out there somewhere. And eventually, years later, a discovery in a remote area would bring investigators one step closer to the answer. As the months passed after Hailey Dunn disappeared, the search slowly began to lose momentum. In the beginning, the entire community had come together to help. Volunteers walked through neighborhoods, searched fields, checked abandoned buildings, and followed every tip that came in. But as weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, hope became harder to hold on to. Memorial gatherings were organized to keep Hailey's name alive, and her father, Clint, continued pushing investigators for answers. For him, the case wasn't just another file sitting in a police office. It was the story of his daughter, and he refused to let it fade away. Then, more than 2 years after Hailey vanished, something happened that would finally bring a heartbreaking answer. On March 16, 2013, a hiker was exploring an area near Lake J.B. Thomas in Scurry County, not far from Colorado City. While walking through the remote land, the hiker discovered something unusual: human remains. Authorities were immediately notified, and the remains were carefully recovered from the area. They were then sent to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification so experts could perform DNA testing. For weeks, the community waited anxiously for results. Then, on April 26, 2013, the confirmation arrived. The remains belonged to Hailey Dunn. The discovery ended years of painful uncertainty, but it also brought devastating reality to her family. The hope that Hailey might still be alive somewhere was gone. Now the case had officially become a homicide investigation. Authorities never publicly confirmed the exact cause of Hailey's death. However, Hailey's father later said investigators told him the most likely cause was blunt force trauma to the head. The case now had a victim, but it still didn't have justice. Investigators announced a reward for any information that could lead to the arrest of the person responsible. But despite the discovery of her remains, the case still struggled to move forward. Years passed without a breakthrough. For Hailey's family, the waiting was unbearable. Her remains had been found in 2013, but the legal process and investigation continued moving slowly. In fact, it took nearly 4 more years before Hailey was finally laid to rest. In January of 2017, the family was finally able to hold her burial. Even after that, the case remained unsolved. Clint Dunn refused to give up. Over the years, he continued posting about Hailey's case on social media. He wrote about her again and again, sharing her story and asking anyone with information to come forward. Those posts eventually caught the attention of someone unexpected. An anonymous person contacted Clint and explained that years earlier, sometime around 2011, they had found several items in an area not far from Colorado City. At the time, they were just a high school student who had no idea about Hailey's disappearance. The items didn't seem important, so they never reported them. But after seeing Clint's posts online years later, they realized those items might actually be connected to the case. The person contacted Clint and told him about the discovery. Authorities were notified, but the exact details of what those items were and where they had been found were never publicly revealed. Investigators kept that information confidential. Even more disturbing was the fact that the items had reportedly been discovered in an area that had already been searched many times during the early stages of the investigation. Around the same time, a private investigator named Erica Morse had been working closely with Clint for years. She had dedicated much of her time to keeping the case alive and pushing for answers. Then, in 2019, Erica began receiving messages from several women in West Texas. These women said they were being harassed online by a man who introduced himself, using the name Casey. That name immediately caught Erica's attention. Casey was actually the middle name of Shaw Atkins. When Erica asked the women to send her the messages and photos they had received, it became clear that the man communicating with them was indeed Shaw. On October 28, 2019, Erica accompanied one of the women to a police station so she could file an official report. But according to Erica, the officer refused to accept the complaint and even accused the woman of making the story up. The situation caused outrage among those following the case. Erica later wrote an open letter warning that if Shaw Atkins wasn't investigated seriously, more victims could appear. But still, nothing happened immediately. 2 more years passed. Then finally, in 2021, something changed. In May of that year, Erica and Clint were invited to a private meeting with the district attorney of Mitchell County. During that meeting, they were told something they had been waiting more than a decade to hear. Authorities believed an arrest was finally coming. Investigators from the Texas Rangers Cold Case Unit had joined the case and started reviewing the evidence again. This special unit focuses on solving crimes that have remained unsolved for years. After examining the case files, phone records, witness statements, and other evidence, investigators requested a court order to collect a DNA sample from Shaw Atkins. That step became a major turning point. On June 13, 2021, the warrant was approved. That same day, Shaw Casey Atkins was arrested. More than 10 years after Hailey Dunn first disappeared, authorities formally charged him with her murder. The news spread quickly through Colorado City. For many residents, it was the moment they had been waiting for since the day Hailey vanished. Even Hailey's mother, Billie Jean Dunn, said she wasn't surprised by the arrest. Over time, she had begun to believe Shaw might have been involved in her daughter's disappearance. Shaw Atkins was placed in the Mitchell County Jail with his bond set at $2 million. The high bond reflected the seriousness of the charges against him, but even with the arrest, the legal process was only beginning. As of the early stages of the court proceedings, Shaw had not yet entered a formal plea. The case would continue, moving through the legal system, which can often take years before reaching a final verdict. For Hailey's father, Clint, the arrest was a moment filled with powerful emotions. For more than a decade, he had fought to keep the case alive. He had called investigators, posted on social media, and refused to let people forget his daughter's story. Now, finally, the investigation had taken a major step forward. Clint later said that words couldn't fully describe how he felt. After years of pain, waiting, and unanswered questions, he hoped the evidence would finally bring the truth into the courtroom. Today, Hailey Dunn's case still represents one of the most heartbreaking stories in Colorado City's history. Her family continues to hope that one day the full truth will be revealed in court and that the person responsible will face justice. For them, this journey has been long, painful, and exhausting. But even after all these years, one thing has never changed. They are still fighting for Hailey.